The land of Britain was once shrouded in myth, dismissed as mere legend by the mighty Roman Empire. To them, it was an obscure and distant realm, barely worth consideration. However, this perception changed in 55 BC when Julius Caesar set his sights on the enigmatic island and led an expedition across the Channel. His initial foray ended in failure, yet marked the beginning of Rome's ambitions in Britain. Nearly a century later, in AD 43, Emperor Claudius launched a full-scale invasion, securing a decisive victory and establishing Roman rule. With the conquest came the founding of Londinium, the construction of military fortresses, and the integration of sacred sites like Stonehenge into Roman religious practices. This was only the beginning of Britain's transformation. To truly understand the history of this land, we must journey back to its the story of what would one day become the United Kingdom stretches far beyond recorded history, deep into the prehistoric Paleolithic period, dating back nearly 950,000 years. The first known inhabitants of Britain were hunter-gatherers who migrated from continental Europe around 800 BC, people now referred to as the First Britons. These early settlers established rudimentary trade networks, exchanging resources such as native elk, wild cattle, and pigs while fending off formidable predators, including wolves and bears that roamed the land. Archaeological discoveries have yielded an abundance of stone tools, meticulously crafted hand axes, and carved flint edges, providing invaluable insight into their way of life. Human remains from this era are exceedingly rare, making it difficult to pinpoint the exact hominid species that occupied Britain at any given time. However, the tools left behind suggest that they were likely a subgroup of Homo erectus, possibly Homo heidelbergensis. Tracking their migration patterns remains a challenge, as the early sites discovered across Europe are separated by vast stretches of time and distance. At one point, Britain was still connected to the European mainland, allowing groups to travel freely before rising sea levels eventually isolated the island, forcing its inhabitants to adapt to their changing environment. These early humans relied heavily on both hunting and scavenging, as evidenced by the wooden spears discovered in Essex, believed to date back approximately 450,000 years. Wooden artifacts are particularly rare, as they decay more easily than stone, making such finds extraordinarily valuable for archaeological research. While stone tools such as hand axes were initially thought to be used for chopping wood, they were more likely employed for butchering animals. The high concentration of these tools at ancient sites suggests that early humans frequently returned to specific locations rather than carrying tools with them over long distances, instead crafting new ones upon arrival. As tool-making techniques advanced, Britain's Neanderthals developed more sophisticated hunting strategies, enabling them to take down larger prey, such as woolly rhinos and mammoths. This marked the transition to the Upper Paleolithic period, a time of significant evolutionary progress. Physically, humans began to resemble modern Homo sapiens, though remnants of their ancestors' traits, such as wisdom teeth, once essential for consuming raw, unprocessed food, persisted. The harsh climate of the Ice Age made survival in Europe extraordinarily difficult. At times, extreme cold forced inhabitants to migrate in search of warmer regions with more abundant food supplies. Limestone gorges and deep caves provided crucial shelter to those who remained in Britain. Around 11,300 years ago, the climate began to warm, initiating a period of environmental transformation. Birch and pine forests flourished, soon followed by oak, hazel, lime, and elm, many of which still dominate the British landscape today. The warming climate also attracted migrating herds of reindeer and wild horses, which, in turn, lured skilled hunters into Britain's evolving terrain. As some species of prey disappeared or moved elsewhere, Britain's early inhabitants had to adapt, shifting their focus to red deer and wild boar. This transition drove further technological innovation, as new tools and hunting methods were required for survival. By the Mesolithic period, around 6300 BC, many groups had established seasonal settlements, strategically moving between summer and winter camps to conserve local resources. Coastal regions became particularly valuable, as the rich supply of fish and shellfish led to the development of specialized tools for ocean-based hunting. The shift from a nomadic lifestyle to early agriculture began around 4100 BC, when farming techniques from the east reached Britain. A growing population and dwindling wild animal stocks made agriculture a necessity. In response, the inhabitants of Britain began clearing land using mass-produced flint tools fitted with wooden handles, creating pastures, fields, and permanent settlements. Barley and emmer wheat became staple crops, while domesticated pigs and cattle provided a sustainable food source. This transition also saw the emergence of permanent dwellings, including longhouses, narrow, wooden buildings used for communal living. Alongside these, early burial structures known as long barrows were constructed, indicating an increasing focus on rituals and the commemoration of the dead. The Neolithic period marked a profound shift in Britain's history, bringing advancements in technology, settlement structures, and landscape management, laying the foundation for the complex civilizations that would follow. During this period, causewayed enclosures became widespread across Britain. These circular earthworks, consisting of concentric banks and ditches, enclosed settlements and were likely used for communal gatherings, trade, and ritual purposes. Within these enclosures, long, rectangular structures known as cursuses were often built, the longest discovered in Britain stretching an astonishing 10 kilometers, approximately 33,000 feet. As hunting techniques evolved, so too did the design of arrowheads. Initially crafted in a leaf-like shape to enhance aerodynamics, they later developed into chisel and transverse arrowheads, making them more efficient and easier to affix to arrow shafts using adhesive or bindings. This innovation was largely driven by cultural exchanges between different groups who shared their craftsmanship and refined their tool-making techniques. By the middle of the Neolithic period, British settlers had gradually shifted away from hunting wild animals, instead relying more heavily on domesticated livestock. As a result, arrowheads became less lethal, used more as deterrents against livestock thieves rather than for combat. This suggests the emergence of social norms that discouraged murder as a form of justice. Between 2600 and 2200 BC, monumental structures known as henges were constructed, the most famous being Stonehenge in Wiltshire. Although definitive evidence remains elusive, it is widely believed that henges served ritualistic and astronomical purposes rather than military defense, given that their ditches were positioned inside the banks, signifying a symbolic rather than practical fortification. As the Neolithic period progressed, significant changes occurred in pottery and toolmaking. Early Neolithic pottery consisted of round-bottomed bowls with sloping necks, but by the later Neolithic, flat-based pots with intricate decorative etchings became more common. These vessels were primarily used for brewing and storing beer, though evidence suggests they also contained dairy products and stews. With increasing social interaction and technological advancements, prehistoric Britons were on the verge of entering a transformative new era, the Bronze Age. The arrival of metalworking around 2200 BC marked the dawn of Britain's Bronze Age, distinguished by the introduction of bronze alloy and the proliferation of beaker-style pottery. Unlike iron, bronze was relatively rare, making it a highly valued material reserved primarily for tools and weaponry. Another precious alloy, electrum, a naturally occurring mix of gold, and silver, sometimes called white gold, was used to craft jewelry, while tin, scarce in much of Europe, played a crucial role in bronze production. Because bronze has a lower melting point than copper, it allowed metalworkers to create complex molds, producing durable and sophisticated weapons such as daggers, halberds, and axes. The tin content within bronze reinforced the metal on an atomic level, making it significantly harder and more resilient than pure copper. Despite the increasing use of metal, beaker-style pots remained in use, their craftsmanship continuing to evolve over time. Some burial sites have yielded remarkably well-preserved beakers containing traces of honey, offering a glimpse into ancient brewing practices. As the Bronze Age progressed, The design of weapons also advanced. By the Middle Bronze Age, daggers had been lengthened into early forms of swords, known as rapiers. With growing tensions between different groups, more sophisticated weapons and defensive shields emerged, and there is evidence of heavy use in battle. Many swords and other arms bear damage consistent with combat. Some weapons were deliberately broken before being buried in hoards, likely to prevent their reuse by rival factions. During this period, cremation became a more common funerary practice, though the scarcity of human remains in burial sites suggests that many were scattered or placed in flowing water, a ritualistic practice observed in multiple ancient cultures. The mastery of fire was not only crucial for cremation, but also for refining metalwork, as artisans developed methods to increase temperatures for more efficient metal casting. Land ownership also became more defined in the Bronze Age, with powerful families claiming and trading parcels of territory. Livestock pens, agricultural fields, and copper mines played a critical role in daily life, fueling rapid economic and technological advancement. One of the most significant discoveries from this period is the Great Ore Mine in Llandudno, Wales, which supplied approximately 90% of the ore used to produce axes across northwestern Europe. Around 1000 BC, climate shifts once again altered Britain's landscape, rendering certain regions uninhabitable due to plummeting temperatures and failing crops. Fertile farmland became waterlogged, forcing many settlements to relocate. The eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland further exacerbated the crisis by darkening the skies with ash, reducing sunlight, and accelerating the cooling trend. While some inhabitants abandoned their lands in search of more hospitable areas, others adapted by constructing raised walkways and elevated dwellings over marshy terrain. These settlements inadvertently preserve a wealth of archaeological artifacts, including pottery, tools, wooden furniture, and even food, within the oxygen-poor bogs below, safeguarding them for millennia. Near the end of the Bronze Age, sword designs evolved further. Rapiers developed into long, flat blades with full tangs cast directly into handles, marking a significant advancement in weaponry. Metalwork had become both an art form and a necessity, yet as bronze became more common, its value diminished. Skilled craftsmen, known as founders, began withholding their wares to create artificial scarcity, marking one of the earliest examples of economic strategy in British history. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was gradual, with the earliest traces of iron smelting appearing around 1200 BC in the Middle East and southeastern Europe. While some late Bronze Age Britons experimented with ironworking, it was not until the full onset of the Iron Age that the technology spread rapidly across the continent. The introduction of iron revolutionized toolmaking, agriculture, and warfare, enabling the construction of sturdier settlements and more efficient farming techniques. By 600 BC, ironworking skills had reached northern Europe, accelerating the development of new societies. The early Iron Age was dominated by the Hallstatt culture, an elite warrior class that built fortified hill forts, controlled extensive trade networks, and raised domesticated livestock. These fortified settlements laid the groundwork for the castles and palaces that would later define medieval Europe. However, by 450 BC, the Hallstatt culture collapsed, paving the way for the rise of other dominant civilizations, including the Mycenaeans, Greeks, Etruscans, Romans, and Celts. Among these groups, the Celts became the most influential in Britain. Organized into various tribes, they spread across the British Isles, Ireland, France, and Spain. Although they shared a common language, the Greeks referred to them as Keltoi, meaning barbarians. The Celtic culture had been expanding since at least 1200 BC, and while their stronghold remained in Britain and Ireland, traces of their vocabulary persist in modern languages. By 700 BC, Roman historians began documenting the Celts, referring to them as Gaeli, another term meaning barbarians. Despite their outsider status in Roman accounts, the Celts established a powerful and enduring civilization, controlling vast territories across Britain and Ireland. For centuries, the Celts thrived, But as the Roman Empire expanded, conflict became inevitable. Julius Caesar launched a brutal campaign against the Celts in Gaul, slaughtering thousands and dismantling their settlements. Though he attempted to invade Britain in 55 and 54 BC, both campaigns ultimately failed, allowing the Celts to maintain control over the island. However, Rome's interest in Britain was far from over. As the empire grew stronger, it set its sights on further conquests. Having already dominated the Mediterranean, the Romans had stormed Carthage, Macedon, Egypt, and Syria before pushing northward through the Alps, eventually reaching Albion, the ancient name for Britain. By this time, Britain's Iron Age settlements had flourished, boasting advanced agriculture, wooden structures, and well-established trade routes with the Gauls of present-day France and Belgium. The Britons exchanged goods, such as wine and the earliest forms of currency, attracting further Roman interest. Though Julius Caesar failed to conquer Britain, his attempts underscored the strategic and economic value of the island. He would not be the last Roman to try. What followed was a dramatic clash between two great civilizations, one that would shape the course of Britain's history for centuries to come. Julius Caesar's interest in Britain was not purely military. He sought to disrupt the trade routes of the Belgae in the English Channel, suspecting that the Britons would provide aid to their allies across the sea. This made the people of Britain enemies of Rome in the eyes of the Republic. Determined to justify an invasion, Caesar persuaded the Roman Senate to support his campaign by claiming that Britain was rich in silver, despite having no evidence to support this assertion. At the time, Britain remained a mysterious and largely unknown land to the Romans. Many within the empire believed that Albion, as it was called, was nothing more than a myth, an island inhabited by uncivilized barbarians whose customs were abhorrent to Roman sensibilities. Among these was the act of drinking animal milk, which Romans found particularly distasteful. However, Caesar's initial invasion of Britain in 55 BC did not go as planned. Roman forces were forced to retreat, unable to secure a foothold. Undeterred, he returned the following year with 5 legions and successfully crossed the Thames River, negotiating a peace treaty with the British chieftain Cassivellaunus. However, before he could establish Roman control, Caesar was compelled to withdraw due to a rebellion breaking out in Gaul and a failed harvest that threatened famine. He never returned to Britain, and following a civil war, the Roman Republic collapsed. Under the rule of the emperors Augustus and Caligula, Roman expansion in Gaul continued, and Britain remained a topic of interest. Yet, despite their ambitions, an invasion never materialized. In a bizarre show of military theatrics, Caligula reportedly ordered his soldiers to hurl javelins into the sea as a symbolic conquest of Britain. It was not until AD 43, under Emperor Claudius, that the long-anticipated invasion finally took place. Led by General Aulus Plautius, Roman legions landed at Richborough on the eastern coast of Kent. The conquest of Britain had begun, although Claudius himself only remained on the island for 16 days. His brief presence was enough to secure a triumphant return to Rome, where he was hailed as a hero. Meanwhile, the Roman military continued its advance, swiftly subjugating the Cativolani, a powerful Celtic tribal confederation, before expanding north and west. By AD 60, most of Wales was under Roman control. Cities such as Londinium, modern-day London, were founded, and new Roman client kingdoms emerged in territories such as Norfolk. The general Vespasian, who would later become emperor, led a campaign into the southwest, subjugating further tribal settlements. Despite Roman dominance, resistance among the Britons remained strong. One of the most notable figures in the struggle was Caractacus, a leader of the Cativolani, who managed to rally support from tribes in Wales to wage a guerrilla war against the invaders. However, he was eventually captured and sought refuge among the Brigantes, a northern British tribe. Their queen, Cartimandua, instead chose to betray him, handing him over to the Romans in a gesture of loyalty. Taken to Rome with his family as prisoners, Caractacus made such an impression on Emperor Claudius that he was spared execution and allowed to live, in honorable exile. The greatest challenge to Roman rule, however, came from Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe and widow of the client king Prasutagus. Upon his death, half of his kingdom was to be inherited by Rome, while the other half was left to Boudica. Rome, unwilling to share power with a leader they deemed a traitor, instead seized the entire territory by force. In retaliation, Boudica led a massive rebellion in AD 60 to 61, razing Roman settlements, including Londinium, and slaughtering an estimated 70,000 Roman citizens and allies. However, the uprising was ultimately crushed by the experienced Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Rather than face capture, Boudica is believed to have ended her own life by poison. In the aftermath, the Romans systematically dismantled remaining resistance, including the destruction of the Druidic stronghold on the island of Anglesey, whose religious practices were considered a direct threat to Roman rule. This marked a turning point in Roman Britain. Under the new governor, Publius Petronius Turpilianus, policies shifted toward consolidation and stability. Over time, Britons gradually assimilated into Roman culture, and once devastated towns were rebuilt, including Londinium, which emerged as the capital of Roman Britain. Roman rule brought significant changes to the island. Taxes were imposed, mining operations expanded, and agricultural output, including livestock and grain production, multiplied tenfold. The introduction of Roman roads, such as those connecting London, York, and the Welsh border, facilitated trade and economic growth, while the slave market thrived. Roman influence was also seen in architecture and infrastructure, with amphitheaters, bathhouses, and Latin education becoming widespread. By AD 130, Britain had become a vital part of the empire's frontier, fortified with military garrisons. However, the vast expansion of Roman territory also attracted new threats. The island faced frequent incursions from the Picts of Scotland, the Scots from Ireland, and Saxon raiders from what is now Germany. To manage the growing complexity of governance, Britain was divided into two provinces, Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior. Despite these efforts, Rome's grasp on the region weakened over time. A significant rebellion briefly separated Britain from Rome, though the empire reclaimed control in AD 296. Yet by the late 4th century, Rome's hold on its provinces was slipping. The rise of Christianity and internal strife across the empire further strained its resources. Food shortages, particularly a decline in grain supplies, hastened Rome's decline. By the early 5th century, as the empire crumbled, Roman authorities informed British cities that they could no longer rely on Rome for protection. This led to the emergence of local governance, as magistrates were overthrown and Britain transitioned into an era of fragmentation. Though Roman Britain had ended, its legacy endured, shaping the culture and infrastructure of the island. In the years that followed, Britain became embroiled in a series of conflicts. Heretics clashed with Christians, Saxon invaders from Ireland and Scotland raided coastal cities, and Europe entered what became known as the Dark Ages. However, Britain's greatest challenge was yet to come. In AD 793, across the stormy waves of the North Sea, a new enemy arrived, the Vikings. The first recorded Viking raid took place at Lindisfarne, where Norse warriors from Scandinavia plundered a Christian monastery, marking the beginning of the 300-year-long Viking Age. As their longships continued to arrive, Viking incursions intensified, targeting settlements in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Eventually, in AD 865, the legendary Viking warrior Ivar the Boneless, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, led the great heathen army to Britain, not merely to raid, but to conquer and settle. Upon reaching the kingdom of East Anglia, its ruler, Edmund the Martyr, attempted to appease the invaders with provisions, horses, and shelter. Despite this, he was ultimately captured, tortured, and executed. Within a few years, the Vikings captured York, the capital of Northumbria. By AD 870, all but one of Britain's kingdoms had fallen, the exception being Wessex, ruled by Alfred the Great. In AD 878, Alfred's forces clashed with the Danes at the Battle of Edington. Emerging victorious, Alfred forced the Danish warlord Guthrum to agree to the Treaty of Wedmore. As part of the treaty, Guthrum was baptized, with Alfred serving as his godfather. The Vikings were also ordered to leave Wessex permanently. Despite the conflict, this marked the beginning of a period of coexistence between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Over time, Viking customs took root in the territories they controlled, including London. This Viking-ruled land became known as the Danelaw, with key strongholds in Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford. Each of these 5 boroughs was governed by Danish armies under the leadership of Jarls, the Viking aristocracy. For nearly a century, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived in relative harmony, trading, intermarrying, and shaping the cultural fabric of Britain. Many words in the English language today have their roots in Old Norse, the language of the Vikings. Words beginning with sk, such as sky, originate from the Viking tongue, as do several common terms including ugly, derived from ugliger, husband from husbandi, gift from gypt, egg from ey, and even Thursday, which comes from Rosdagar, meaning Thor's day, a day dedicated to the Norse god of thunder. The Vikings also had a profound influence on legal terminology. Their structured system of law not only introduced the word law into the English lexicon, but also the word wrong, reflecting their belief in defining what was unacceptable within their society. While Alfred the Great used the period of peace to fortify his kingdom by building defensive strongholds, his daughter, Ethelflaed, turned these fortifications into military assets against the Vikings. Following the death of her husband in 911, she assumed control of Mercia, earning the title Lady of the Mercians. Under her leadership, the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw were gradually reclaimed from Viking rule. By 954, the last Norse king of Northumbria, the legendary Eric Bloodaxe, was expelled, effectively bringing an end to the era of the Danelaw. England was now unified under Anglo-Saxon rule. Although Viking rule had been dismantled, their ambitions in England were far from over. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard and his Viking warriors returned, launching a successful campaign that saw Sweyn crowned as the first Danish king of England. Following his death, his son Nut the Great ascended to the throne, ruling until 1035. However, the era of Viking dominance ultimately came to an end in 1066, when King Harald II of England decisively defeated King Harald Hardrada of Norway at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This marked the final Viking invasion of England, and their forces were expelled from the land forever. Despite their military defeat, Viking heritage endures, preserved in the DNA of their descendants and embedded within the language, culture, and traditions of modern Britain. The Middle Ages and the fall. Of the Anglo-Saxons, the Middle Ages and the Viking Age overlapped, with the medieval period beginning around AD 400 and lasting over 1,000 years, ending in 1485. Historians typically divide the Middle Ages into 3 phases: the early, high, and late Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages were defined by the rule of the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, both of whom ultimately fell in 1066. Following the death of Edward the Confessor, England faced a succession crisis, leading to the famous Battle of Hastings. The Anglo-Saxons, despite their advancements in governance, agriculture, a settlement expansion, were ultimately defeated by the Normans. However, their contributions to society endured. During the Anglo-Saxon period, families built single household dwellings that accommodated multiple generations, from the youngest child to the eldest grandparent. These homes, constructed from timber with thatched roofs, were clustered closely together around a communal hall, which served as the heart of the community. The hearth, or central fire, was essential, providing warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Agriculture was the backbone of Anglo-Saxon life. The vast majority of people were farmers, responsible for growing crops, breeding and raising livestock, preparing food, and clearing forests for farmland and construction. Even children played a role, herding cattle and sheep with the help of trained dogs. Alongside farming, skilled trades thrived. Blacksmiths forged weapons and tools, carpenters built carts and furniture, cobblers crafted leather shoes, and jewelers created ornate pieces of metalwork for trade. One of the most significant Anglo-Saxon innovations was the plow, which revolutionized farming. They also discovered that horses were far superior to oxen in plowing fields, vastly improving agricultural efficiency. However, despite their ingenuity and resilience, the Anglo-Saxons could not withstand the Norman invasion. The Norman dynasty began with William the Conqueror, who ruled England from 1066 until his death on September 9, 1087. The Norman conquest and its impact. The Norman conquest of England was no small feat. Even the formidable Roman Empire had struggled to bring the island fully under its control. William's success earned him renown across Europe, and under his rule, the landscape of England changed dramatically. The first stone-built Norman castles were constructed, beginning in Wales before spreading throughout England as strongholds against resistance. The Normans also introduced impressive stone architecture, including the breathtaking Canterbury Cathedral, completed in 1070, the Tower of London, finished in 1078, and Oxford University, founded in 1096. Additionally, William commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, a comprehensive survey of land ownership and valuation across England and parts of Wales. Despite William's reputation as a great ruler among the Normans, the feudal system he implemented severely impacted the Anglo-Saxon population. Under this system, a quarter of England's land was seized by the crown, another quarter was granted to the church, and the remaining half was distributed among William's loyal followers. Anglo-Saxon landowners were reduced to peasants, stripped of their ancestral holdings, and forced to work for their Norman overlords. Those in positions of power were required to raise armies for the king when called upon, though they often delegated this responsibility to knights, who in turn conscripted the peasant farmers into military service. With advancements in agriculture, Norman cuisine became more diverse. They developed a taste for spices such as caraway, ginger, cardamom, pepper, and nutmeg, often incorporating them into festive meals. Wealthy households indulged in grand feasts featuring pheasants, peacocks, wild boar, jellies, and custards, while peasants relied on salted and pickled foods like herrings, bacon, and vegetable broths. The nobility drank wine, whereas the lower classes consumed strong Irish. The High and Late Middle Ages from the 11th to the 13th centuries, the feudal system cemented a rigid class hierarchy, leading to significant social unrest. Rebellions and uprisings disrupted the kingdom, while the Renaissance ushered in a wave of artistic and literary expression. This era laid the foundation for playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, who used historical events as inspiration for their political and romantic narratives. Modern portrayals of the Middle Ages, filled with gallant knights, noble maidens, and towering castles, romanticize a period that, in reality, was fraught with hardship, disease, and violence. For the majority of people, life was arduous, and social mobility was nearly impossible. The anarchy and the civil war of 1135 to 1154 following the reign of William the Conqueror, a succession of his descendants occupied the throne. However, in 1135, a major conflict erupted. William's grandson, Stephen of Blois, ascended to the throne, but his cousin, Empress Matilda, contested his claim, believing herself to be the rightful heir. This resulted in a devastating civil war known as the Anarchy, which lasted from 1138 to 1154. The war plunged England into chaos, affecting all levels of society. The nobility was divided, peasants suffered under oppressive conditions, and lawlessness spread across the kingdom. Distrust and desperation led to brutal acts. Innocent people were tortured for information. Thieves plundered villages, and entire families were left destitute. Famine and economic hardship claimed countless lives. In the end, the conflict was resolved through a compromise. Stephen remained king, but he acknowledged Matilda's son, Henry II, as his heir. Upon Stephen's death in 1154, Henry II ascended the throne, bringing an end to the anarchy and ushering in the Plantagenet dynasty. The civil war between Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda came to an end in 1154 with Stephen's death. Matilda's son, Henry II, ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of the Angevin Empire. His reign was relatively stable and prosperous, strengthened by his early friendship with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Together, they wielded significant influence over both the people of England and the Church. However, their alliance was short-lived. Becket's increasing defiance of royal authority led to tensions between them, culminating in Henry's infamous outburst, which some of his knights interpreted as a command to kill Becket. On December 29, 1170, Thomas Becket was murdered inside Canterbury Cathedral, an event that shocked Christendom and tarnished Henry's reputation. The concept of personal freedom in 12th century England was complex. Some men, known as villains, were bound to the land and owed their lords labor and payments, while others, freemen, paid rent without feudal obligations. Some occupied a middle ground, working for a lord while paying for their land. If a person failed to pay taxes, they were subject to the will of their overlord, who could impose severe punishments. For those who sought to escape their feudal ties, there was one alternative. If a fugitive managed to live in a borough for a full year without capture, they were legally granted freedom. However, if caught before this period elapsed, the lord had the right to imprison or punish them as he saw fit. King John and the Magna Carta King John, who ascended to the throne in 1199, is often regarded as one of England's most despised monarchs. Greedy, ruthless, and prone to cruelty, he ruled through fear, imposing heavy taxes to fund his wars and hiring mercenaries to maintain control over his subjects. Even the Pope was not spared from John's wrath. In 1208, when Pope Innocent III appointed Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury against John's wishes, the king refused to acknowledge him. In response, the Pope placed England under interdict, meaning church services, including burials, were suspended. Despite this, John remained defiant, refusing to back down. Matters escalated when the Pope excommunicated John in 1213, releasing all English subjects from their oath of allegiance to him. This weakened John's authority and provoked widespread rebellion. Taking advantage of the instability, the King of France, Philip II, challenged John's rule and sought to claim English lands. Faced with internal revolt and external threats, John was forced to negotiate with his rebellious barons. In 1215, he reluctantly agreed to sign the Magna Carta, a landmark document that placed restrictions on the monarchy and established the principle that the king was not above the law. Of its many clauses, four remain enshrined in English law to this day. Even after signing the Magna Carta, John continued to struggle. With a French invasion underway and his kingdom in turmoil, he ultimately conceded and accepted Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. This restored some stability, enabling the English forces to repel the French at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217. However, John's reign left a lasting legacy of distrust toward absolute monarchy, paving the way for the establishment of constitutional governance in England. The birth of Parliament and the Black Death in 1265, King Henry III, John's son, faced opposition from Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. Unlike the king, de Montfort believed in giving ordinary citizens a voice in government. Although the Magna Carta had established legal precedents, it was de Montfort who laid the foundation for England's parliamentary system, summoning representatives from towns and shires to discuss national matters. These early members of Parliament were compensated for their service, much like today. By 1298, Parliament had secured control over taxation, cementing its role in governance. However, the stability of the kingdom was shattered by one of the deadliest pandemics in history, the Black Death. The plague arrived in England in 1347, spreading rapidly and devastating the population. Over the next 3 years, it claimed the lives of an estimated 1.5 million people in Britain and over 200 million across Europe. For centuries, it was believed that the disease was spread by rats, but modern research suggests that it was primarily an airborne bacterial infection. Victims typically succumbed to the illness within days. The plague hit the lower classes the hardest, as peasants lived in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, with corpses piling up. In the streets and medieval medicine powerless against the disease, entire villages were wiped out. The labor shortage caused by mass death led to economic upheaval. As peasant workers became scarce, they gained leverage over landowners, demanding higher wages and better conditions. However, when the government attempted to restrict their movement and wages, frustration erupted into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The rebels sought the abolition of poll taxes, an end to feudal obligations, and the right to freely own property. Though the revolt was crushed, it marked a turning point in the decline of the feudal system. The Wars of the Roses and the rise of the Tudors. Another defining conflict of the Middle Ages was the Wars of the Roses, fought between the rival houses of Lancaster and York from 1455 to 1485. Both factions were descendants of King Edward III and sought to claim the throne. The war culminated in the Battle of Bosworth Field, where King Richard III was slain, bringing an end to Yorkist rule. Henry Tudor, leader of the Lancastrians, was crowned Henry VII. To solidify peace, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two warring houses and establishing the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor era, a new chapter in English history. The Tudor period ushered in an era of significant political, religious, and economic transformation. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth in 1485 marked the beginning of a 118-year reign for the Tudor monarchs, whose rule would shape England's future. The marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York ended decades of conflict and consolidated royal power. To ensure the continuation of his dynasty, Henry and Elizabeth had 8 children, though only 4 survived into adulthood: Arthur, Henry, Margaret, and Mary. Arthur, the eldest, married Catherine of Aragon, but died prematurely, leaving his younger brother, Henry, as the heir. Margaret married James IV of Scotland, securing an alliance between England and Scotland, while Mary married King Louis XII of France. Upon the death of Henry VII in 1509, his second son ascended the throne as Henry VIII. Originally destined for a career in the church, Henry's fate changed following the deaths of his father and brother within a span of 7 years. His reign would be one of the most transformative and controversial in English history. Desperate for a male heir, Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon after she failed to produce a surviving son. When the Pope refused, Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, granting himself the authority to remarry. Over the course of his reign, he married 6 times, fathering several children, though only one son, Edward VI, survived infancy. Henry's religious reforms, known as the English Reformation, had profound consequences as Protestantism gradually replaced Catholicism as the dominant faith. Following his death in 1547, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited the throne. However, Edward's reign was short-lived, as he died in 1553 without an heir. Edward's devout Catholic half-sister, Mary I, known as Bloody Mary, seized the throne and sought to restore Catholicism, leading to the persecution of Protestants. Her efforts were met with resistance, and after a reign marked by religious conflict, she died in 1558, passing the crown to her half-sister, Elizabeth I. The Elizabethan Golden Age, Elizabeth I's reign, 1558 to 1603, ushered in a period of cultural and economic prosperity. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth had to work hard to gain the trust of her subjects. Intelligent, charismatic, and politically astute, she navigated the treacherous landscape of 16th century Europe, securing England's position as a major power. Her era saw the flourishing of the arts, with playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe revolutionizing literature. Elizabeth's leadership also strengthened England's navy, leading to the famous defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. By the time of her death, she had cemented her legacy as one of England's greatest monarchs. Despite her successes, Elizabeth I faced numerous challenges throughout her reign, including assassination attempts by Catholic conspirators, an attack from Rome, and growing pressure to marry and secure an heir. Nevertheless, she overcame adversity and earned lasting titles such as Gloriana, Good Queen Bess, and the Virgin Queen. When she passed away in 1603, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. Before the Tudor era, England's economy was primarily agrarian, with nearly 90% of the population working the land. Life was harsh, and the average lifespan was short. However, as the age of exploration began, England's focus shifted toward trade and industry. The mining of coal, tin, iron, and lead expanded significantly, bringing great wealth to the country. Yet, despite economic growth, famine and poverty remained widespread in Tudor England. In 1530, harsh laws against beggars were temporarily repealed, allowing vagrants to beg legally if they obtain a license. This led to a rise in the number of beggars, prompting a new law in 1547 that imposed a 2-year prison sentence on anyone caught begging. In 1550, the law was amended again, replacing imprisonment with public flogging, where vagrants were whipped as punishment. Recognizing the growing social crisis, Elizabeth I introduced the Poor Law in 1601, which provided tax-funded relief and assistance to the impoverished. During this period, England's legal system increasingly favored physical punishments over imprisonment. Common crimes were punished through public humiliation, such as flogging and time spent in the stocks, while more serious offenses, such as murder, were still met with execution. The nobility and wealthy criminals were typically beheaded, while the lower classes were hanged at public gallows, drawing large crowds eager to witness the spectacle. Education and leisure in Tudor England. The Tudor period also saw a growing emphasis on education. Richard Mulcaster, a leading educationalist, argued that a boy's education was of the utmost importance, as men were deemed more worthy of intellectual pursuits. Consequently, boys from affluent families were sent to grammar schools and universities, while girls, despite being ruled by a female monarch, were largely excluded from formal education. Instead, they were expected to master domestic skills, such as needlework, cooking, and household management. Over time, limited schooling opportunities for girls emerged, primarily focusing on literacy. Eventually, local schools were established where boys and girls studied together, though opportunities for higher education remained restricted for women. Leisure activities became increasingly popular during the Tudor era. Wealthier citizens engaged in pursuits such as tennis, chess, and card games like Primero and Noddy, a precursor to cribbage, while commoners enjoyed football, gambling, and attending jousting tournaments. The end of the Tudors and the rise of the Stuarts. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, she left no heir. The English throne passed to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Having been executed for treason, Mary had become a Catholic martyr, leading many to hope that her son would support Catholicism in England. However, James was determined not to repeat the mistakes of Queen Mary I and refused to reverse the Protestant Reformation. Disappointed by his stance, a group of Catholic conspirators plotted to assassinate him and restore Catholic rule. Their plan, known as the Gunpowder Plot, involved detonating explosives beneath the Houses of Parliament on a day when the king would be present. In 1605, the conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and Guy Fawkes, smuggled barrels of gunpowder into a storeroom beneath the House of Lords. However, the plot was uncovered on November 5th, and Fawkes was caught before he could ignite the explosives. He and his fellow conspirators were executed by the gruesome method of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The failed plot is commemorated annually in Britain as Bonfire Night, celebrated with fireworks and bonfires. Despite the assassination attempt, James successfully united England and Scotland under a single monarch, ending centuries of conflict between the two nations. However, his son, Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625, would soon plunge the country into turmoil. The English Civil War. Charles I was deeply devoted to the Anglican Church and a great patron of the arts, but he attempted to rule without Parliament. believing in the divine right of kings. When he needed funds, he was forced to recall Parliament but refused to share power with them. This led to mounting tensions, and in August 1642, civil war erupted between the royalists, who supported the king, and the parliamentarians, who sought to limit his authority. The conflict escalated rapidly, with an estimated death toll reaching into the millions over the 9 years of warfare. Castles that had not been used for military purposes since the Middle Ages were suddenly thrust into action as opposing factions laid siege to key strongholds. Control of these fortresses provided strategic advantages on the battlefield. In 1647, Charles I was captured by the Parliamentarian army, led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. He was imprisoned at Carisbrooke Castle, where negotiations for peace were supposed to take place. However, Charles secretly conspired to launch a second civil war, which broke out the following year. This betrayal sealed his fate. He was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and executed in 1649. The execution of a reigning monarch shocked both Britain and Europe. The monarchy had been abolished, and England was declared a republic, known as the Commonwealth of England. However, Charles's son, Charles II, attempted to reclaim the throne with the support of the Scots. His efforts failed, and he barely escaped with his life, famously hiding inside an oak tree at Boscobel in Shropshire to evade capture.